the attacks last night are a very real reminder of some of the forces that were unleashed by the war in Iraq. I think we all know that ISIL is a direct successor to al-Qaeda in Iraq, and al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged from the war in Iraq. I think it probably is worth reminding everyone that while Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda had nothing to do with each other in the run-up to the war, which was an argument many were making, they certainly had a lot to do with each other after the war. And so that's another tragic consequence of that particular conflict. Today we're going to look at the lessons learned in Iraq from the Iraq War, not only sequentially but also thematically. This morning's session is just really some reflections by two of this country's foremost defense and security experts, with no Q&A in this first session, but you'll have plenty of time to ask questions in the subsequent sessions with some really great people on the panels. Personally, I commend this government for undertaking this review. In the United States, there hasn't really been anything similar. There were a couple congressional hearings. There was a book that was published by the Special Inspector General for Iraqi Reconstruction called Hard Lessons, and I was involved early on in helping them, advising on that book. I don't think anyone in this room has probably seen that book. It's 500 pages, and I would challenge any of you to ask an American official if they've even heard of that book. And so, while the report may have taken 7 years to carry out in this country, and many people say there's nothing new, it's still, I think, very important. It was a very important exercise, and I wish we had done the same in the United States. There isn't really any accountability for many of the people who really made the decisions that took this country into war as well. So I think this morning, looking forward to hearing from both Mike and Malcolm, who have really a deep understanding of the war prior to the war in the planning phases, in the run-up, in the early phases of the war, and then, of course, during the war itself and the aftermath. They'll have some very interesting reflections for all of us. I think the challenge for the two speakers and for all of us who are speaking today is to try to say something new. So much has been written about this war, and so many things have been said. So we'll try to challenge ourselves to come up with some new insights if possible. I think neither of these people need any real introduction. Mike Clark, as you know, former DG, and Malcolm is the deputy here. You have their bios in front of you, so I won't go into any more details, but just a reminder that today's session, all the sessions are under RUSI rules, which is the presentations are on the record and the Q&A is off the record, and we'll turn the cameras off during the Q&A period. So please tweet away during the formal presentations, but please observe RUSI rules during the Q&A period. And then, of course, after today's event, the RUSI Journal and our website will have many further reflections on Chilcot. So why don't I start with you, Mike, and please launch in and give us some of your thoughts, and then we'll turn to Malcolm.
Karen, thank you. Great pleasure to be back, even though it's a sad day because of the events in Nice, but there's more of those to come, I'm sure, before we get through this period of history. And I was asked to make a few general comments here on trying to put the report into perspective, which I'm very happy to do. And then in the first substantive session, I'm going to be saying something about the run-up to war. So my comments in this part are very general about the report and trying to put it into a little bit of perspective. As we famously say, those who don't learn from history are bound to repeat it. And Marx's famous phrase that history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce. I think if you've been in the middle of UK politics in the last month, you'd have to say that when history repeats itself in the United Kingdom, it repeats it first as farce and then as even more farce. However, this report, in a sense, is slightly overshadowed by the political crisis of the last month, but it shouldn't be. It's at least the fifth major report on the issue that has grabbed the public attention, which is Tony Blair. Tom Bower's book, Broken Vows, is in a sense, that's the alternative Chilcot report in his book. And he begins the book from the assumption that Tony Blair is pretty guilty, that he told lies, that he was a warmonger, that he behaved illegally. That stands as a series of allegations. And I think Tom Bower actually probably is probably, that's the best version of what I would call that conspiracy theory. But this is at least the fifth major report, and far and away the most important that we've had. In 2003, there was the Hutton report on the David Kelly affair. There was the Butler report in 2004 on intelligence issues, intelligence failings. And then the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Defence Committee in Parliament both did more than one report on different aspects of the run-up to war. But this, of course, has taken a long time. That now doesn't matter because this is the most important report, and it is, I think, by common consent, extremely good. I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this. It is an official history that has been written in a contemporary way with access to all of the sources, including sources that an official historian might not get to look at for a very long time, plus the individuals, while they're still hot from the event, they haven't yet adjusted their stories, they're still alive, they're still compos mentis, most of them. All of that has created a report, the sources of which are quite unprecedented. The Tony Blair issue, it seems to me, was he lying, did he behave illegally, I think is put to rest by this report. And the issue is not, in a sense, his integrity, but his presiding over a systemic failure within government. It is, in a sense, his style and his ability to be the key decision maker, which is at issue. And I think what the report points to, for my money, is a systemic failure, which is why a lot of people assumed that criticism would go far and wide, that personal criticism would go far and wide. And in a way, it hasn't. The report does not criticize a lot of people directly that might have expected to be criticized. It just lays out the record, and history can judge. The specific criticisms, I think, have been leveled where I think they belong, at the very top. So the chiefs and CDSs and the Prime Minister and ministers. People lower down, I think, are not criticised. It is a case study, a contemporary case study in decision-making. And if I had to provide a single headline for this, I'd say it's all about home furnishings. It's too much time on the sofa, not enough time in the cabinet. Too much sofa government, the way Tony Blair, as it were, behaved in government, the way he made his decisions, not enough time in cabinet, or at least using the cabinet system in the way that one assumes it should be used. We all asked ourselves, what is new in this report? What is likely to be new? Will it tell us anything we don't know? In broad outline, it gives us chapter and verse on what most of us in the analysis business had already made our minds upon. Of course, there's a wealth of fabulous detail. I mean, a lot of that material is gold dust to analysts and historians. In particular, the 29 letters between Mr. Blair and President Bush is extremely interesting and important. And there's a great deal of military detail. So in those respects, the report it provides evidence of what a lot of us had decided was probably the case, and it provides a lot of nuance. But I think it highlights more than I thought it would the way in which cabinet government was not working in the way that we would have assumed it did. And in that respect, there's a big difference there. My final general point, really, by way of introduction, is the question of the consequences. What did this all mean? Because the report will be used, in a general sense, by journalists and analysts to argue about the effect of the Iraq war on what's happening in the region today. I think it's very clear from the report. I think it supports the idea in general that this was a strategic blunder, in the sense that it was a war that was to the advantage of the United States' main adversary, Iran. The country that's come out best from this is Iran. And so in terms of what was the war trying to achieve, in that respect, it was a blunder. Did it increase the relevance and the authority of the Security Council? Not really. Did it contribute to non-proliferation? Not really. All this was happening at a time when North Korea was trying to draw the world's attention to its nuclear program. So on the broad strategic front, if there was an A.J.P. Taylor writing about this in 50 years' time, he would write a couple of pithy sentences saying that the war was a strategic blunder because it didn't achieve any of its real objectives. There were 179 British military deaths, 27 of them in snatched Land Rovers, and what the report has to say about that, I think, is very interesting and very damaging to the Army's reputation. 200 British civilians were killed. More to the point, at least in this period, 150,000 Iraqi deaths occurred, and at least 1 million Iraqis were made homeless. All of that is different. The question is of whether the subsequent chaos owes very much to this. And I would argue not very much. The chaos in Iraq that we see now as a result of the ISIL initiatives really arises from the Maliki, Prime Minister Maliki, and his mishandling of the army that was left to him, the mishandling of government, the Arab Spring that began in December 2010, when it started, owed nothing to Al-Qaeda at the time, nothing to the Arab-Israeli dispute, nothing to the Cold War, nothing to the Iraq War. It was a genuinely spontaneous uprising, which then created transition and chaos. And of course, in a situation of chaos, it is entirely logical that the hardliners, whoever they are, take advantage of that, which is what has happened. And of course, as a counterfactual issue, if the war had not taken place, if Saddam had remained in power, where would Saddam have been in 2008, 2009, 2010? If Saddam had still been in power in a very authoritarian Iraq that was kowtowed by his autocracy, what role might have been played then, either in global terrorism or in the Arab Spring? I mean, who knows? But as a counterfactual, it's an important consideration. There are many other issues which are going to be dealt with today on post-war planning, the military response to events. But one final comment I would make, just in general terms, before we get into the run-up to the war, is that when we stand back from this and look at the circumstances of 2003, it's also clear that from a British point of view, and to a degree internationally as well, Iraq and Afghanistan undermined each other. Our involvement in Afghanistan in 2001 was intended to be an involvement to kick the Taliban out. And if I take the expletives out, as a Special Forces commander said to me recently, he said, what we intended to do was leave a brown envelope on the table with a dagger through it saying, don't do this again, minus the expletives. And suddenly, and he said, I don't know where, we found ourselves nation building in Afghanistan in late 2001, early 2002. Well, okay, if that became the mission, then at the very point at which we needed to consolidate on that, 2002, 2003, our attention moved to Iraq. And just when Iraq needed to be consolidated in 2003, 2004, we moved our attention back to Afghanistan. And so there is a sense in which we allowed both of these operations, particularly in Britain, to actually take our attention away from the other. They undermined each other. And I think strategically, that's not directly dealt with in the Chilcot report as such, but that is one of the big conclusions that I draw from this. So my general sense of it, before we get into any of the detail, is that I think it's a superb report. It is historically unique. I don't think it won't answer the questions on Tony Blair that those people who want the Tom Bowers want. They won't get out of it what they want, and like three versions of the Bible, they'll dip into it and find enough in there for what they would like to create. But for me, the Tony Blair question is we'll just carry on. But no, he did not lie. No, he did not behave illegally. He presided over a government that did not handle this crisis at all well. And the systemic failure that comes out of that, I think, is the perspective that we should put on it. So that's my opening view.
Great. Well, thank you. Malcolm, let's hear it from you.
First of all, Karen, can I say what a great pleasure it is to have Mike back giving this presentation, and marvellous, and I'm sure we'll see more of you in future. Absolutely stunning presentation. And I will just say a few words in addition to what he said. I think one of the reasons we put on this event is to have a chance to discuss the Chilcot report when some of us had read at least some of it. Myself and a number of my RUSI colleagues had a storm of media asking us to comment on the report the day before it came out. And then an even bigger storm to comment on it in the half hour after it came out. And I remember standing in front of a BBC cameraman having barely read the chairman's summary and fortunate, just about to appear on air. And then I was gazumped by Tony Blair coming on his press conference. The BBC thought he might be talking for about 10 minutes. And he went on for 2 hours, including the Q&A. So being gazumped by Tony Blair, it doesn't happen to any of us every day. But that was symptomatic of that day it came out. Lots of commentary, lots of wise words, but nobody had actually read the report. And we thought it'd be useful to have this event after people had at least read some of it. And I think, as Mike says, it's a really excellent piece of work. It will be unchallenged, I think, in its key conclusions. Much of it accords with what people said on the basis of significantly less evidence already. And I would still commend the findings of our Wars and Peace book, which Mike and I both contributed to a couple of years ago, copies of which are on sale outside, which I think that the conclusions of that, which draw parallel with other interventions, I think in many respects remain valid. It was a particular interest to me because I served in the Foreign Office during the middle of this period, not at the beginning, but in the middle of the period, just after the switch to Afghanistan, which Mike talked about, happened. And I know from my own experience that many of the accounts ring true, not least the sense of the atmosphere in government during this period. Certainly by the time I arrived in 2006, it did feel as if the strategic objective was to get out. And we'll talk more about this in a subsequent session. I traveled to Iraq 3 times during my time in the Foreign Office with the Foreign Secretary and was involved probably every day in one way or another in Iraq issues. But I think by 2006, there was a lot more happening in the world. And one of the things which inevitably doesn't come out in the report is that not right at the beginning, but after some period, lots of other things were taking up ministers' attention. This was not the only thing government was looking at. As it were, the train tracks had been set by the end of 2003 in all sorts of many significant respects. So what I wanted to do is just make 5 brief points to get us started for the rest of the day. The first is, I think I would underline the statement right at the beginning of the chairman's summary, in which he emphasizes how unique this intervention was. Some of the difficulties of drawing lessons for elsewhere is that this was actually a very unique intervention. It was the first opposed invasion and full-scale occupation of a sovereign state since 1945. When people tried to draw parallels, they were drawing parallels with Germany in 1945, so many different respects, because there wasn't anything parallel to this in the subsequent half-century or more. And that's linked to the inquiry's conclusion that this was an intervention which went badly wrong with consequences to this day, and Mike has summarized what those were. And it's also, I think, striking how little government was mobilized for such a unique and groundbreaking, world-changing intervention. One of the, and again, Chilcot's overall thesis, one of the most powerful overall theses, and I quote, "A step of such magnitude should be taken deliberately and having considered the wider strategic and resource implications and contingent liabilities." A marvelous prescription from a former civil servant about how things should be done in an ideal world. And when I read that quote, I couldn't help thinking about the last 3 weeks. We've had a situation in which a step has been taken not because the breadth of the British government civil service bureaucracy thinks it's wise, or there's been a considered calculation about the national interest, but because of external political forces making a decision. The British people have spoken, and now the government has to work out how to tackle it. to serve the will of the British people. And in a sense, I think the parallel with Iraq is that the initial decision was taken in terms of the UK by the Prime Minister. I mean, I agree entirely with the way Mike characterised it. I don't think there was deceit involved, but the Prime Minister had the authority, which nobody else in government did. It was his decision, and I think without his decision, the involvement would have been very different. But moreover, and here I think the parallel with Brexit is actually quite important, the initial decision then led on to a series of subsidiary decisions, each of which was not anticipated, and each of which led to more issues. And you get a real sense in Chilcot of the machinery of government running to catch up with new developments, especially in that first period, which they hadn't anticipated. They didn't really have much say in deciding upon, and were driven in large measure by the United States, but also by the Prime Minister. It was even in February 2003. It wasn't entirely clear. Well, it was becoming clear then that we were going to take responsibility for stabilization in 4 provinces in southern Iraq. So you can hardly prepare for that responsibility if you haven't decided to take it on until only a few weeks before the invasion took place. So I think that parallel is very important. Now, we've seen even in the last couple of days the way in which a radical reorganization of Whitehall is taking place to respond to the decision taken 3 weeks ago. And we'll see how that plays out. One day, I'm no doubt, there'll be a Brexit inquiry of some sort to see how Whitehall responded to this exogenous shock. But I think one of the things that's striking from Mike's comments, which I also agree with, is that it's right that the report has focused criticism at the top rather than particular ways in which particular bureaucrats further down the chain responded, because in the end they responded to an unprecedented and unexpected exogenous shock. And the second link point, more briefly, is that it comes across very strongly that the British influence over the United States in this process was pretty limited. We were punching above our weight. We were being asked to punch above our weight and contribute to resources which it was difficult for us to mobilize. And I think that that dependency was exaggerated by the commitment, the whatever commitment, and the commitment to be with the United States, whatever, so that the reduced leverage as a result of that. But I wouldn't exaggerate. That's not the only factor. It was also simply because of the disproportion of resources between the United States and the UK. And we had a coalition authority as if we were two powers of relatively equal weight, as if we were in 1944 in the Normandy landings or whatever. But the disproportion was absolutely massive, and that was reflected in our relative lack of power. Third, and Jim Naughtie talks about this in his book, what's striking domestically is how in many respects the Prime Minister was acting out of character in this decision. He wasn't, in general, an ideological Prime Minister. I mean, he won election in 1997 for not being ideological. His achievements in Northern Ireland, his achievements, I think his more subtle approach, as Jim Naughtie describes it, in relation to the European Union, and his approach to domestic, economic and social affairs was strikingly centrist and pragmatic. And Naughtie had a marvellous line where Blair said he didn't know what a neoconservative was. And there was a sort of naivety about his approach which is very, very striking. Hillary Clinton said that what's happened to Tony, he started drinking the Kool-Aid. There was a sense in which he went off the reservation. He went off what was otherwise more of a centrist consensus in the UK with political consequences which we're living with today. Fourthly, I think, and this comes across very much in the Russi book, the pairing with Afghanistan is going to be critical to the wider lessons learned. This is a report only on Iraq, although it does talk a little bit about the problems with the Harmony guidelines and so on when the switch, the Afghan mission, really, the Helmand mission started ramping up. But In retrospect, I think looking back, it's a sense, I mean, one of the big questions is, in deciding on Afghanistan, why didn't we learn the lessons about counterinsurgency we were learning in Iraq? If Afghanistan decision had been taken maybe a year later, maybe we would have learned more from Iraq. And I think one of the strongest criticisms actually is in relation to that, which we can talk more about perhaps in one of the subsequent sessions. And my final point is really about the form of the report. As a long-term academic like Mike, of our generation, we love reports like this. We love the serious evidential base, the maximalization and checking sources to make sure they're comfortable. It's exactly what would come out of a King's College guide to master's dissertations or PhD dissertations, but on a much higher quality even than that. But working in a think tank today, how many of our think tank scholars get a chance to read the marvelous books in the library upstairs? How much pressure do we have to produce the one-page memo, which is all that ministers or senior policymakers, we are told, will read? Sometimes it seems like something from another world, in many ways a better world. And in a way, some of the criticisms of this period are precisely that decision-making went too far away from those perhaps rather traditional values, traditional approaches to policymaking. In the end, in a very complex world, there's a real danger in oversimplifying policy issues. And I think that's a lesson actually for commentators and think tanks and journalists, that one of our roles in places like RUSI is when people ask us for a soundbite, we're the people who are prepared to say there is no soundbite. The world is complex, and we've actually got to take the time to consider. So for that reason, but for many others, I very much welcome this report.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you for really helping us to frame the day. And so